Good evening, everyone. My name is Connor Moran. I'm the director of the Wisconsin Book Festival. I am so delighted to be hosting Stacey Abrams this evening for her new book, Our Time Is Now. I'm additionally just overwhelmed to be hosting Stacey as the third annual Cheryl Weston Memorial Lecture. Cheryl was my law professor. She was a longtime donor to the festival well before I became the director. And she in 2018, she left the festival a bequest and endowed us with funds to grow in so many ways. And one of those ways is $10,000 that she made available for us to buy books tonight to be distributed for free to the 600 people. And I will put that link up once the conversation gets underway. I will also put a link if you have the means and you want to let someone else claim a free book. I will put a link to the same book that you can buy from our partners at A Room in One's Own bookstore. I'm also honored to have this be part of their From Books to Ballot initiative all year long. I hope that you will support them and all independents wherever you are watching from. Cheryl Weston was a lawyer. She was a professor and an entrepreneur, and she loved the library. She once said, "I believe that this is the most important public institution in the city. The library is for everyone. This is an institution that is educational and social and cultural and free. And there's nothing else like it." And I couldn't be more honored to kind of pick up that mantle and be those things for people. I'd like to take just a moment to thank Cheryl and her estate for their leadership and support of the Wisconsin Book Festival and Madison Public Library. I also want to thank Madison Public Library, as always, and the Madison Public Library Foundation for really believing in free cultural events and doing that through the Wisconsin Book Festival. Since we've gone to virtual events, their enthusiasm and unwavering support of the festival as something we have to do has been truly astonishing, and I couldn't thank them more. So thank you to them. As I said, it is such a pleasure to be hosting Stacey Abrams tonight. Stacey will be joined by Ben Wikler, chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party. Ben has a long history of working to further social causes with groups like MoveOn.org and the Wisconsin Democratic Party, and also getting Democrats elected at the local, state, and national levels. So it is really wonderful to have him be in conversation this evening. And Stacey Abrams, I spent most of my day thinking, what is there to say? And Stacey Abrams is so many things. She's an 11-year veteran of the Georgia House of Representatives, and 7 of those as the minority leader. She is the Democratic nominee in the 2018 Georgia gubernatorial election. And as such, she was the first African-American woman nominated to run for governor by a major party in any state. If we were all together, I would say we should take a moment and clap for that. So I'll do that. And as in her role as the Democratic nominee for governor, she is also the top Democratic vote getter in Georgia election history, which also I think deserves a round of applause. So you can clap at home. She is a serial entrepreneur. She is the founder of numerous organizations, including Fair Fight 2020, the New Georgia Project, and Fair Count. And for our specific purposes tonight, she is the essential and New York Times bestselling author of Lead from the Outside, and most recently of Our Time Is Now. I hope that you will help me welcome Stacey Abrams and Ben Wikler.
Thank you so much, Connor. I'm Ben Wikler. I'm the chair of the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. I get to reintroduce our guest of honor tonight, and I'm thrilled to have you with us. Maybe I can just invite you to say hello before we get into our conversation tonight. We're thrilled to have you.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Connor, for such a generous introduction and for the solitary yet rousing applause. Thank you to the Cheryl Rosen Weston Memorial and to A Room of Our Own for the books and for encouraging not just literacy, but engagement. So thank you all. And I have to do one more thing, Ben. I was born in Madison, which you may mention, and my mother, who was studying to be a librarian while in Madison, Wisconsin, is watching. So hi, Mom.
Awesome. We have a lot to talk about. Your book is extraordinary. Before we get into it, I'd like to ask, we're at a moment where there are protests, beautiful and righteous protests across Wisconsin, in towns small and large, across Georgia, across Minnesota, everywhere in this country, sparked by a brutal murder, but connecting to a much broader struggle. And in your book, you write about race and segregation and white supremacy as at the heart of the fight for voting rights and democracy. I wonder if you could kick us off by sharing your reflections on what we are seeing across the country at this moment in the context of the struggles that you have fought in throughout your life.
Thank you. When I think about and look at the protests, when I have conversations about these moments, I reflect back on my first independent decision to be involved in protest in 1992, another presidential election year, another year where police officers were videotaped beating someone, beating a Black man. And the response in that moment was to finally hold a trial, but the exoneration of Rodney King's attackers happened in April of 1992. What is so important is that that moment in 1992 echoed back to the 1960s and the 1800s and the 1700s. It has been a part of our national legacy for so long. But what is so different in this moment is that unlike 1992, where there were flashes of anger and anguish and pain, where people did their best to engage, by the time we got to the November elections, that outrage had dissipated. And unfortunately, a very different reality set in terms of how we were going to think about and respond to the brutalization and the dehumanization of African Americans. What we're seeing in this moment is a sustained engagement that is also generating legitimate and thoughtful responses. And what I really want us to think about is that we may not get the instant answers that we want. We may not get every single policy we deserve. But in this moment, we have seen the connective tissue of the centuries of struggle and the connective tissue of the dehumanization that is being realized and finally in these moments we think being remedied. But that remedy is not permanent unless we engage in the same type of activism, in the same type of action, in the same type of voting that has been what has connected those dots, what has threaded through our history, through this fabric. It is never permanent, but these are moments that become real when we demand not simply lip service to our pain, but action, and that action is driven by our engagement in our elections.
Thank you. One thing I loved about your book is how it weaves together the story of our country, the story of the fight for the ballot, the story of this moment, and also your own personal story. So I hope you'll forgive if we look through those different pieces as we talk tonight.
It's my fault. You're free to.
As you mentioned, you were born here in Madison, where I'm broadcasting from at this moment. How did your parents' path come to Madison, and where did it go next?
My parents are both natives of Hattiesburg, Mississippi. They met when they were teenagers. They became teenage sweethearts. They both attended Tougaloo College. But before they went to college, my parents, both before and during college, my parents were activists. My father was arrested at the age of 14, helping to register Blacks to vote in the state of Mississippi. And he did so at a time where he was still 7 years away from being old enough to even think about voting himself, had that been legal. We like to tease that my mom was doing the same work. She was just smart enough to get caught, not to get caught. They both went to Tougaloo College, and my mom received a fellowship to the University of Wisconsin at Madison to study library science. She attended that school. My dad worked in one of the labs at the University of Wisconsin. He wasn't enrolled in a program there, but he was very much my mother's partner in her education, particularly because I had an older sister who was 3 when I was born. I was born there while my mom was finishing her program. I had another sister, the third of us, who was born the following year. And eventually my parents returned back to Mississippi to their home. But for 3 years of my life, we lived in Wisconsin. And I remember 2 things fairly clearly. I remember being cold, and I remember cheese curds.
Those are very familiar memories to many of the many people who are tuned in right now. Your story is an intergenerational one. And one of the stories that was kind of unforgettable is when your grandmother was first eligible to vote. and you described what she said, which is something that might surprise some of the folks watching tonight. Could you share that story?
Sure. When I was running for governor, I came home to visit my grandmother. She was ailing. She lived with my parents. This is my father's mother. And I went to visit her in the room, the sort of mother-in-law suite that they'd given to her so that she would have a space of her own. I went back to see her, and we ended up having a conversation, as we often did during the campaign when I had a chance to come home from Georgia to Mississippi. And we ended up talking about the first time she voted. And it was fairly spontaneous that she told me about that moment where she was afraid to go and vote. And it wasn't just this fear of the dogs and the hoses. It wasn't just a fear of, having lived most of her life divorced from real citizenship in our country because of Jim Crow, because of a lack of civil rights and voting rights. It was also a fear. What I heard in her voice was a fear of power. We take for granted so often, those of us who with ease can cast a ballot, we forget that it is not long ago that the power of the ballot was a terrifying power that had been promised and withdrawn, promised and withheld so frequently that her fear was that she just didn't want to do it. She didn't want to risk it. I think she not only didn't want to risk the likely outcome of the violence, but there was also a psychic violence that she had experienced that made her afraid of that power. And it took my grandfather urging her, cajoling her, and I think fighting with her to get her to express the shame she felt about that fear. And eventually she voted. But the reason I opened the book with that story is that I want people to recognize that it's not this simplistic arithmetic, if I want, I vote. For so many Americans, especially Americans of color, the right to vote has been this thing that was held out as the shining opportunity, but it has so often been a trap. It has so often been a moment to say, here's what you could have, but then to deny it, that we cannot begrudge those who fear it, who fear either its power or the failure of its promise.
When you were growing up, how did voting become a part of your life?
My mom and dad were very intentional about our engagement in community. We were working poor. My mom was a college librarian, but she sometimes made less money than the janitor who cleaned the college. My dad was a shipyard worker, incredibly smart man, but because of his dyslexia, couldn't get a job in an office. And so we lived in that working poverty that too many of us know. But they were very intentional. They said we had 3 jobs: go to church, go to school, and take care of each other. And these were inviolate. There was no conversation about it. This is what you did. But embedded in that notion of service for my parents was not only taking us to go volunteer, which we would sort of wave our hands. We're like, we're poor too. They did not countenance that was an excuse. It was, my mom would say, no matter how little we have, there's someone with less. Your job is to serve that person. My dad was more succinct. Having nothing is not an excuse for doing nothing. But what they both wanted us to understand was that the act of service was not the end of obligation. The act of going to a homeless shelter or volunteering at a soup kitchen, of working in a youth prison, that the responsibility was to also be engaged in the life of democracy. And so they would take us with them to vote. As I mentioned, when we left Wisconsin, I was one of 3. By the time I remember going with my parents to vote, I was one of 5 and then one of 6. So when they would take us with them to vote, we looked like make way for ducklings. So you had all these little kids trailing out of the voting booth because they didn't just want us to know they were voting. They wanted us to see and experience it. In part, I think, because they understood the visceral reality of actually having this power that their parents and their grandparents that they had grown up knowing would never be theirs, and they had fought to achieve. And they never wanted us to doubt that it was our right as well.
You watched your parents vote, you went with them to vote, and then most people might never become voting rights activists, although your book might change that. You started actually getting involved in working to help people cast their ballots, to do the different things. How did that begin, and why did you decide to do that?
It started when I got to college. I was 17 when I started at Spelman. I wasn't old enough to vote, but I I volunteered because it was the year before a presidential election. And I think I just volunteered to sit at a table and help get people registered. I remember being the only nerdy 18-year-old who was excited on my birthday about the fact that I could finally register to vote. I was very excited about that. And then it became a part of what I did. I would set up a table in Manley Plaza, which is sort of the main area at Spelman College, and was roundly ignored by many of my fellow students. But my responsibility was to be out there to say, here is this power that we have access to. And because we were in the midst of a presidential year, the primaries had just started up, but I wanted people to understand, like, this is something you can have. I was also a very nerdy kid or teenager who also went to city council meetings at the city of Atlanta. I went to zoning committee meetings because our college sat juxtaposed with one of the poorest housing developments in the state. And in my mind, the fact that these two things could coexist in the same very small square footage was about what government was or was not doing well. And I, talked to my parents about this when we were growing up. Like, it seemed to me a bit disconcerting that, two Black folks and their 6 children were going to fix Mississippi. And my parents said, no, that's, we're going to do what we can. But there are these other people, these elected officials, this government that is responsible, and we have to hold government accountable for its obligations. And so for me, voting was directly connected, not just to my civic duty, but also to my very deep despair about the disparities that existed between where I was able to go to this august college and these young people for whom many college would never be an opportunity.
To ask one more question about that period in your life, there are so many young people now who are, there are people who are thinking about this election that we're facing this fall, and there are people protesting. And your course actually, you did both things. I wonder if you could share with us about the aspect of that period where you were involved in organizing protests and how the pieces came together.
Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, I was involved in the 92 protest against the Rodney King decision. I was a freshman in college, the end of my freshman year. We were actually taking exams. And when that verdict came down, I was part of a group of students from Spelman, Morehouse, which is another Morehouse College, the Clark Atlanta University, Morehouse School of Medicine, and a couple of graduate schools. And we organized a march from the campus down to City Hall. But the next day, the anger and the despair and the anguish and the outrage became even hotter. And it led to much more aggressive protest. Part of my responsibility at the time, I took responsibility for helping to organize a phone tree to correct the record. I wasn't engaged in those protests directly, but as I thought about the privilege of my space to be at Spelman versus somewhere else, and there, but for the grace of God, I should have been. Part of what drove me was this reality that when the protests got loud and angrier, they cordoned off the entire Atlanta University Center. They cut off access from the freeway, and they tear gassed us all. They dropped tear gas. It was a chaotic and horrific scene. And what I realized in that moment was I may be a student at Spelman College, a college that had a show about it, but all they saw were unruly Black kids. And our humanity, even in a city that was run by African-American leadership, their diminution of who we were was real and was not going to dissipate simply because I got a degree. And so I ended up being invited, because I was fairly vocal, invited to the simulcast for people who were way young. That's before, before there was a lot of cable and before you had YouTube. All the television stations would sort of share a studio and broadcast and share a feed. And I ended up getting into an argument with then Mayor Maynard Jackson. Maynard Jackson was the first African-American to lead the city of Atlanta. He was one of the youngest mayors in our history. He was one of the first Black mayors in America. And he was also very imposing, 6'5". I am not. And so, I'm haranguing this man, telling him about all the things he wasn't doing. And he chastised me and said, what do you know? And I said, well, I go to city council meetings and I go to zoning committee meetings. And, you have things to help left-handed people cross the street sideways, but what are you doing for young people? What are you doing for poor kids? And he soundly and roundly rejected me, and he won that argument. I have no shame in saying, but less than a year later, he invited me to become the first student employed in the newly created Office of Youth Services. And that for me was this change moment, because I saw that there could be this connection, this connective tissue between activism and then being able to take action, to go inside the beast, the halls of power and see what I could do. And I also learned that power is not instant, and access does not mean that action happens. But there was something remarkable to me that has stayed with me that says that, but for my activism, but for those protests, my voice may not have been heard, but also because of what I was able to do working for the city, and from there working in various levels of government, I wouldn't have understood how you move the levers of power to try to get things done.
Part of the arc of your story after that is almost then doing the reverse. You went on to earn a slew of degrees, and after earning your Yale Law doctorate, working and practicing law, getting elected to the state assembly, you did something that most legislators don't do, which is to start an organization that went out and did organizing work. Tell us, which any legislators watching, it's a great idea. How did you come to do that? What was that fight? And I think we'll go from there into what you're fighting against and for, which kind of speaks to the moment we're in now, where the fight for the ballot is so contested and so all-encompassingly important.
So my life as a protester did not end that day. I've had a few more collegiate activities that we can talk about later if you'd like. But as I went through, it was always in my mind that your title and your platform have nothing to do with your action. That I don't have to have a title. I don't have to be an employee of the city of Atlanta, or, as I discovered later, the governor of Georgia, to have responsibility to do the work. And so I become Democratic leader in 2010 at the end of the Tea Party sweep, at the tail end of essentially the demise of the Democratic Party writ large. We lost every statewide election. We'd lost the Senate to a super minority. So you in Wisconsin are very familiar with that situation, where Republicans had enough votes to pass constitutional amendments in the Senate without consulting Democrats. And they were within a handful of votes of doing the same thing in the House. And so I said, let me be in charge. So I ran for and became the leader. That following year and into 2013, I was engaged in a number of pitched battles, and the most salient of which was in 2013, a fight about the Affordable Care Act. Georgia was one of the states that refused and made difficult the acceptance of federal funds, not just for Medicaid, but also for navigators, for the people who were supposed to go into community, especially communities without a history of having employer-based healthcare, and explain, how do you get health insurance? What do you need to look for? What questions do you ask? Well, Georgia refused the money. And in addition, they put these just absurd restrictions on what you could do to be a navigator. And it was designed to diminish the number of people who would participate. So I had created this nonprofit organization when I was in law school called Third Sector Development. And I thought, well, if they're not going to give us the money for navigators, I'm going to find money and make our own. So I raised $100,000 because I got really good at begging. And I had this nonprofit that accepted this money. And we hired more than 65 folks from the poorest part of the state. SEIU came in and trained them for me. And we deployed them across 39 counties to sign people up for the Affordable Care Act. But what we kept encountering was that we could go into a household or into a neighborhood, and maybe 2 people could sign up for the ACA, but you had 5 people who were denied because they were so poor they had to have Medicaid. And they thought it was President Obama's fault that they couldn't have it. They didn't understand that the governor and the state legislature had made the decision not to expand Medicaid. And so I wanted them to understand it. I did my research, and what I found was that not only did they not understand this because of the poor civics education around healthcare, we had 800,000 people of color in the state of Georgia, 600,000 of whom were African American, who were not registered to vote. They were eligible across all of the metrics. They just hadn't been registered. And so being an organizer, being the daughter of Carolyn and Robert Abrams, I shifted the focus of the New Georgia Project from being a project about navigators getting signed up for the Affordable Care Act. And instead we became a fairly aggressive voter registration operation. And as of this year, it's an independent organization. We spun it off in 2017. When I got ready to run for governor, I handed the reins over to its CEO, Stacey Abrams, who's done amazing work. But more than 400,000 people of color have been registered to vote by our organization.
So you did the organizing, you're doing legislating, you ran for governor. I read in the book, and I've heard you share the story of the coalition that race mobilized, and I would love to ask you to, or invite you to share about that wave that organizing helped create and how it happened, and then about the kind of machinery of voter suppression that it ran into, and that kind of brings us to the present moment. So, I guess one question would be to tee this off. Are you the governor of Georgia right now?
Shockingly, I am not. But I am not. I know I'm not. Breitbart sometimes thinks that I'm surprised, and I think Tucker Carlson would, anyway, I'm not going to give him too much airtime. Suffice it to say, I know I'm not the governor. But here's what we did. We, for the first time in a major campaign like ours, we centered communities of color. I believe that identity politics is good politics because it says, I see you, I understand your barriers to opportunity, and I know you want what everyone else wants, but there are impediments that have to be known and called out if they're going to be fixed. So we centered communities of color. We brought in the marginalized and the disadvantaged, but we also reached out to everyone. Early in my campaign, people would chide me and say, well, because you're talking to communities of color, you're not talking to white voters. Like, I'm not exclusive. I'm saying that I'm going to acknowledge this thing that often goes unsaid, but I also campaigned where they filmed Deliverance. So I'm pretty good and pretty okay with a broad base of conversation. What I also refuse to do is, I was asked again and again, are you going to try to woo back those Obama Trump voters? Two things. One, they were likely Bush, Obama, Trump voters. But more than that, I'm inviting anyone to join us, but I'm never going to compromise or change the way I talk about my values in order to entice them, because it's disingenuous to them. And it also is repulsive to those people who need us. And so my responsibility is to be honest everywhere. So I told the same story. I talked about the same issues when I was up in, the heart of the, where when the Confederate battles were held in Dalton, Georgia. But I also went to Albany, which is predominantly Black, predominantly poor. I went to Latino communities. I went to mosques. I went to temples. I visited mixed documentation status communities. I went everywhere. I went to all 159 counties, and I talked about the exact same thing to everyone. I talked about gun reform at a gun show. I was not shy about my platform. I wasn't shy about what we could accomplish, and it worked. In 2018, Connor was kind enough to point out that I received more votes than any Democrat in Georgia history. But I want to break that down. We tripled Latino turnout for Democrats in the state of Georgia. We tripled Asian Pacific Islander turnout. We increased youth participation rates by 139%. We increased Black participation by 40%, which doesn't sound nearly as exciting as tripling and 139%. But to put that in context, in 2014, Jason Carter, the grandson of President Jimmy Carter, ran a respectable campaign and turned out 1.1 million Democratic voters total. In 2018, I turned out 1.2 million Black voters. And then you add those other voters. So in the end, we ended up with 1.9 million votes, 1.9,023,000. But the other piece is this. I also increased the white participation for Democrats for the first time in 30 years, including getting 31% of college-educated white women and increasing on almost every metric of voters. And that happened because I believed that we could build a coalition that was multi-generational, multi-ethnic, multiracial, and that progress and being progressive was more than just a slogan. It had to be demonstrated in the policies we talked about. But I ran into the buzzsaw that is Brian Kemp. Brian Kemp was the Secretary of State. He was I refer to him very intentionally as the architect of voter suppression for modern Georgia, because the first time I ran into Brian Kemp and his voter suppression was back in 2014 when I started the New Georgia Project, and we had the temerity to register more than 86,000 people of color. He refused to process 40,000 of our applications. And what we discovered later was that the applications he swore were missing were part of one of his building blocks of voter suppression. They were held hostage by this program called Exact Match. An exact match was used to say that when you applied to register to vote, if there was any discrepancy between the information on your form and databases they compared it to, your registration could be rejected. Now, mind you, the discrepancy may have nothing to do with you. It could have been typographical errors made by the bureaucrats entering the data, or the databases themselves having flaws, but all you knew was that you weren't eligible to register to vote, and they never told you what the problem was. What Brian Kemp did over his tenure as Secretary of State, he oversaw the closure of 214 polling places. And I know Wisconsin has very recent experience understanding what it means to shut down a polling place. In the state of Georgia in 2018, independent analysis said that that accounted for between 54,000 and 85,000 people not being able to cast a ballot. He also purged 1.4 million voters from the rolls, including overseeing the single largest voter purge in American history. And hundreds of thousands of those people purged were not purged because they'd moved, were not dead voters trying to vote again. They simply had not exercised their right to vote. And as I like to point out, you shouldn't lose your right to vote because you don't vote. I didn't go hunting on Saturday. No one's coming to revoke my Second Amendment rights. And so that was one of his problems. So and then using the exact match situation, in 2014, it was 34,000 that we were able to prove over the course of 3 years that he'd blocked from being able to vote. In 2018 alone, it was 53,000 people who had their registrations held hostage, 70% of whom were African-American, 80% of whom were people of color. So he was the scorekeeper, the referee, he was the contestant, and shockingly, he's the governor.
So, you referred to the building blocks of voter suppression, and one of them is exact match. What are the other pieces of this machinery so that all of us can see what we're up against? And I know folks will get in more details when you read the book, which everyone who's watching should buy, for the record, as well as the audiobook, which you narrate, which I'm really enjoying.
Thank you.
Also, yes. So what are these building blocks?
So let's think about this. Voter suppression has different iterations in each state that engages in voter suppression. But there are basically three parts to the taxonomy. It's, can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you cast a ballot? And does your ballot get counted? And so registration and staying on the rolls, states like Georgia, it's exact match. States like Florida, it's the restrictions they put on third-party organizations to register voters. In Florida, their rules became so onerous that the League of Women Voters refused to try to register voters for fear of the penalties of exercising a practice that they had been doing for more than a century. So it's, can you register and can you stay on the rolls? Look at what happened in Ohio with their attempted purge. The second part is, can you cast a ballot? Wisconsin is ground zero. 2015, the voter ID laws changed. And let's be really clear, voter ID is not a problem. Since we've had voting, we've required identification. The issue is suppressive, restrictive IDs. It's when the IDs required are so restrictive that they intentionally weed or effectively weed out certain communities. In Wisconsin, it was the requirement that you be able to produce an original birth certificate. And in 2016, a lawsuit was filed against the state of Wisconsin because a Black woman born in segregation in Missouri 100 years before could not produce an original birth certificate because Missouri under Jim Crow would not allow her to be born in a white hospital, so she didn't get a birth certificate. And that is true for thousands of people born during segregation. Well, she was able to show her information from a 1930s census, and yet Wisconsin, despite her having voted in previous elections in Wisconsin and there being no question of who she was or her eligibility, she was denied the right to vote in Wisconsin. In North Dakota, the restricted voter ID was that they added the requirement of having a residential address, knowing that in North Dakota, Native Americans living on reservations do not get residential addresses. And so they created a suppressive, restrictive requirement that, while facially neutral, had the very intended effect of narrowing and pushing out of the process a certain community, namely communities of color. So that second group is, can you cast a ballot? And then we also go to the issue of shutting down polling places, or worse, forcing people to vote in person during, a pandemic. And then the third is, does your ballot get counted? That states like Texas, Georgia, Wisconsin has some challenges. Minnesota is doing better about it. But when you turn in your ballot, there's this thing called signature mismatch. You sign the back of your absentee ballot. They match it to the thing you signed maybe when you registered to vote. Well, I registered when I was 18. My signature looks nothing like that. I'm fairly certain I was much sunnier at that point, so my S's were probably loopier. But as I point out, my signature doesn't match from CVS to Kroger, and it should not be a predicate for rejecting my right to democracy. And yet we have dozens of states that use signature mismatch laws, which is junk science. I mean, essentially, we're asking a poll worker who may have watched, an episode of Forensic Files to determine the legitimacy of my citizenship when I cast a ballot. And so it's the overuse of provisional ballots. There's a whole list of challenges that I go into in greater detail, but all of the things you have to remember is this. We have 50 states and 50 different ways to do it, but it all falls into these three categories. Can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you access a ballot? And does your ballot get counted?
So Brian Kemp uses all three of these things
Yes.
to steal an election, in my view. And you then retire from public life and are off now, just a writer. Is that right? Or did something else happen next?
I've been hanging out. So in the 10 days between Election Day and what I like to refer as my personal holiday of non-concession day, I spent the first few days, I was actually really sick and I was always very angry. I went through those stages of grief that you're taught about when you take freshman psych. I went through a lot of the stages at the exact same time. And I spent a lot of time with anger. Anger was really a comfortable place for me. And it was unusual because I'm not used to being that angry about things. My youngest sister, Janine, was sort of dispatched by my family to be my minder during that time, she had, an excuse a day to come and check on me. But what I also realized by day 4 or day 5 was that I was fairly certain that I was not going to become governor, that what this man had done, the combination of incompetence and malfeasance, the poor maintenance of the databases, the intentional disruption of democracy, he was probably going to win. And so my responsibility was to do what I added an 8th stage to the stages of grief, which I refer to as plotting. And I started thinking about, okay, if I don't have the position of governor, I made these promises when I was running. I talked about these issues that I was going to lead on. I talked about how we could together as a state move forward. What could I still do even if I didn't have the job? And so the first piece was Fair Fight. There are 2 parts to it: Fair Fight Action, which is our C4, and Fair Fight PAC, which is our very political arm, including the program of Fair Fight 2020, which I'm hopeful we'll talk about because Wisconsin is one of our extraordinary examples of the work we were able to do. And the purpose of Fair Fight was to ensure that voter protection and that vote protection happened and that voter suppression was attacked. And while we may not be able to defeat it without legislation, we can pummel it as much as possible through the actions that we have put together. And we're operating in 18 states. The second was Fair Count. I spend a whole chapter talking about the census because this is one of those ingredients of voter suppression, ingredients of systemic racism and systemic inequities that we so often gloss over. We don't understand as a nation, and particularly as folks who are seeking progress, that the inputs in that census determine the course of a decade of our lives. Every community lacking PPE in this ravage of COVID-19, you can directly trace, I promise you, it to whether or not folks in those communities were undercounted in the census, whether they didn't get the economic support they deserved, or whether they didn't have the political power to which they were entitled. We are in the midst of another census year, and Fair Count is designed. We are one of the only organizations whose sole purpose is the US Census, making sure that hard to count communities get counted. And then because I'm from the South, the third organization I created is called the Southern Economic Advancement Project. Our goal was policy. And so if sort of in my mind, the ecosystem was the right to vote and to select your leaders, the ability to guarantee that those leaders could see you and invest in you and that you could hire them through the census. And then what are the policies we need to make those promises real? And so SEEP, as we call it, has been working most recently through a project called South Strong, where we are doing our best to figure out what policies are necessary and how do we galvanize recovery for the South from COVID-19 and how it has decimated Southern communities, especially Southern communities of color and poor communities. So I had 10 days, so I did a few things.
You launched these organizations. Each of them is having a transformative effect across the country. I want to take a moment to say on behalf of all the Democrats in Wisconsin and the Democratic Party of Wisconsin, thank you. Folks watching, I want you to know that after I became chair, I went to the meeting of all the state party chairs, and Fair Fight was there giving a folder to all the battleground states explaining exactly how to set up a voter protection operation. Stacey and her team raised the funds to help us hire that team. They trained that team, and we had a voter protection team starting in January, which we've never had in a spring election before, that took thousands of calls and outreaches from people who were having trouble and being disenfranchised, and worked with them to get affidavits, hundreds of them, went to court, fought all the way to the Wisconsin and US Supreme Courts. And while the party line votes shut down a lot, we actually got enough relief that more than 100,000 people cast ballots in the 6-day extended period. Thank you, Stacey Abrams, for all that you helped make possible in Wisconsin. We're going to take questions from the audience, and there are a lot of great questions, so I'm going to kind of try to smush some of them together. A lot of the questions come down to this question of what can viewers, what can citizens do and non-citizens do right now during this period in this next 4 months, especially in a state like Wisconsin, where we're about to have an election that will shape all of our lives.
So the first half of the book, Our Time Is Now, is about all the things that are being done to us. The second half of the book is what we can do to it. It's about making sure, number one, if you have not filled out your census, fill it out. The Trump administration underfunded the census by $5 billion. They litigated to the Supreme Court attempts to restrict who could be included in the census by putting on the citizenship question, which wasn't just about, despite Senator Ted Cruz's admonition today that it was just about meeting the responsibilities of government. No, it was designed to terrify communities out of participation, because according to the memo they relied on, if the citizenship question went on the census would reflect, and I quote, or I paraphrase, a whiter, more Republican country. And so fill out the census, even if you are white, because if you're watching this, you probably care about democracy, care about America, care about people. So fill it out, because I don't want anyone not to be counted. I want everyone to be counted. And if you have filled out your census, find 5 people that you know probably haven't and remind them to fill out their census and let them know it's safe. There is no citizenship question, and they are giving away money and political power if they don't fill it out. So that's number 1. Number 2, go to and if you want more about the census, go to faircount.org for more information. For the elections, we have to remember that we're not running just a redo of the 2016 elections, which is what most people are thinking about. This is a chance to get rid of Donald Trump. That is true, but that is the least of our worries, because we have to elect not only a president, we've got to elect a Senate that actually believes in the people of America, that will pass a COVID relief bill that actually relieves the pressure and the pain of this economic collapse and this public health catastrophe. But we also have to remember that in addition to running the 2016 election, we're also running the 2010 election. And Wisconsin, if you guys don't remember what happened in 2010, let me remind you. That's when you guys got Scott Walker. We have to remember that what happens in this election cycle is going to set the tone, but also set the legal parameters, the political lines for the next decade. And if we do not make certain that we flip state legislative chambers across this country, pick up those seats in Wisconsin so that we can protect the veto for Governor Evers, if we do not do this in this election, then they will control the mechanisms of government, not for the next decade, but for the next generation. They've already eliminated Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. They've already filed suit to get rid of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which means essentially they can run amok with the type of racist and classist behavior that is limiting access to the right to vote. They have already stacked the Supreme Court as much as they can, but they want to do more. They will continue to take over the judiciary, and we are already under the, machinations of a tin pot wannabe dictator and, populist authoritarian in training who will have absolutely no restraints on him. So we've got to win 2016 and 2010 in the same election, but we can if you go to Fair Fight 2020 and sign up as a volunteer, because Wisconsin needs your help. The Republicans are building an army of 50,000 voter poll observers around the country in the 15 battleground states as they see them. And what they intend to do is intimidate voters, much in the way they did in 1981, where they had off-duty officers wearing armbands, radios, and firearms, walking up and down lines of voters, mainly Black and brown, asking them if they had the right to vote, challenging their legitimacy, their citizenship, and saying they will be monitored if they vote. It was so egregious. They were under a court order not to do this for 40 years. Guess what? The 40 years are up. The consent decree was lifted. This is the first year that they can do this on a national level, and they plan to do it through litigation, but also through advocacy. And our responsibility is to do the same, to be the poll observers standing in those same lines, reminding people that the right to vote is one of our foundational rights as citizens, and no one can take it away. And so sign up to volunteer, sign up with the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. Ben Wikler's awesome. You've got an amazing voter protection director. They need your help. They need your assistance. They need your voices, and go help them. And if you're watching from anywhere else in the country, no matter where you are, someone needs your help to protect our elections. If we protect our elections and we complete our census, we have the building blocks for a better nation starting in 2021. And by God, if we get there, I want that to happen.
Thank you. Everyone, hope you're taking notes. There are several questions about, I'll read chunks of each. One person says, the murder of George Floyd has exposed the inequities in the country. How do we create a level playing field? Another person asked, how do we dismantle systemic racism, not only in Wisconsin, but around the country? Another person wrote, as a Black man living in one of the most racist and inequitable states in the country, what insights could you offer to white people about relinquishing power at the policy level to allow for new and diverse political leaders? So each of those speaks to a different part of a broad question.
So let's start with the last part first. It has been said in many ways, but the fundamental reality is power concedes nothing. People don't give up power. They may claim to, they may promise to, they may mean to, but power is seductive and it is captivating. And so it is a rare occasion that anyone who enjoys it and who wields it will ever give it up. They may let you come visit, they may let you pet it, they may let you take it out for a walk, but they're not going to give it to you. And so our first responsibility is to take it. And the way we take power is by using the mechanisms available, protest and politics. Those are two absolute equal forces, because protest raises awareness and politics makes the ideas real. And that goes to the first question. There's been this false dichotomy that's out there about what we can do and how we can do it. There's this notion that you either have to be on the side of reforming or you have to be on the side of protecting. The reality is we can do two things. We can reform law enforcement practices, not that tepid, useless announcement that was made by the president yesterday, and not, unfortunately, I think the well-intentioned words of Senator Tim Scott, which would have been a great solution in 1992. But we're in 2020 and we need and demand more. We must demand the end of chokeholds and similar force types of use of force. We must demand the end of no-knock warrants. We must demand states that have things like citizen arrest warrants, the end of those things. We must demand actual policies that go beyond simply reporting, studying. We've studied long enough. We've had more than 200 years of studying police brutality against Black people. We know it happens. We need to solve it now. But those solutions will only happen if we vote. And I know voting sounds like an anemic response to something so vicious and so pain-inducing and rage-inducing. But in a democratic society, it's what we have. Because we can protest in the streets, but we also protest at the ballot boxes. I liken systemic racism, systemic injustice to a disease. And there is no disease that is solved with a single pill. Even if you take a Z-Pack, that Z-Pack has to be taken for a number of days, and it's only going to work for a little bit of time because more than likely you're going to get another cold, you're going to get sick again. Well, we have this disease that has metastasized since our inception. And it is a combination of systemic racism and systemic inequities because we were founded by people who lied, who said in their emancipation and their Declaration of Independence, they declared they believed in equality, but everything they did since that moment was about preserving their power. And so we cannot assume and we cannot presume that one action, that one election, that one savior is going to dismantle anything. The only way you replace the structure of evil that we have is by building a superstructure that is stronger and more formidable and more resilient. And that is going to take time because we've been at it for 200 years, but we've only had real participation by most of the people who need to be here for the last 50 years. So let's be clear about what kind of world we have to fight with. But we have to hold on to the fact that we've made extraordinary progress despite how hardened and cemented this racism, this inequity is. And the fact is that we can't dismantle it piece by piece, but we can chip away at it. We can build over it, and we can try to crush it. And what I'm so excited about, the reason the title of my book is Our Time Is Now, is that we are for the first time in American history at a demographic inflection point where there are more of us who want good than there are of them who want to conserve what has been, unfortunately, whether it's benign or intentional, has been aggressive evil. Because it is evil to deny people access to healthcare. It is evil to deny people access to food. It is evil to deny them security that can be so easily had. And when those denials are based on race and gender and sexual identity and religion and all of these things that are either immutable or simply irrelevant to our humanity, then it is evil. And so my belief is we can dismantle it, but we have to be patient. And I'm not saying patient waiting for it to change. I mean patient knowing we're going to have to work hard, that we're going to have to go through treatment after treatment after treatment, because like any growth, like any disease, if you let up for a second, it will metastasize and return with even greater force. And so we can't believe that the election of Barack Obama was going to solve racism, that the election of Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House was going to solve and create progress. Those are good people with good intentions, but they require the investment, the support, and the consistent and relentless engagement of all of us as citizens. That is the very dissatisfying answer for anyone who wants to believe that there is a short way to get there. But we're talking about power. We're talking about trillions of dollars. We're talking about the ability to move nations and the ability to preserve what people have gotten used to. I will say this. I do not question the hearts of everyone who considers themselves conservative, but I'll point this out. The very nature of being a conservative means you want to hold what you have. You want to not, you are trying to avoid change. You want to conserve the existing. And if the existing is built on systemic racism and systemic inequities, you need to really rethink whether conservation is the place to be. I'm a progressive because I believe in moving forward, and I know we can, and I think now is the time.
You spoke to this just now, and I'd love to ask you to expand a bit more. And you write about this powerfully. Who is the our in now? Our time is now. Who is us?
Us is anyone who believes in progress, and that's the beauty of what I want us to think about. when we think about the isms that infect America, that infect the world, actually, and let's not say that America has a singular and remarkable way of discriminating, but we're not alone. But it's every community, especially communities of color. Because we have to remember that with the inception of our nation, Black people weren't human, Native Americans were invisible, women were supposed to be silent. And that in 1790, the Naturalization Act basically said if you weren't white, you don't count. It took decades, centuries for us to start peeling that back. And we have to remember that the Chinese Exclusion Act was designed in order to block access, that there were a number of laws, and I talk about this in the book, to tell Latinos that they weren't welcome in the nation they helped found. So we have to remember that color, race, ethnicity has been at the core of the ignominy of America for a very long time, since its beginning. That Native Americans didn't become citizens in our country until 1924. And so we have to hold that and know that they are part of our. We have to know that this week, when we celebrated the Blaylock decision that said that for the first time, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 applies to sexual orientation and gender identity, that means that you're part of our. When you have to demand your inclusion, when you have to demand the wholeness of your citizenship, you are part of our. If you're young, we're trying to break everything before you get it. You're part of our. If your race or your religion has been used against you, I'm a Christian. My parents started out as a librarian and a shipyard worker. They both became pastors. I'm a double PK. And they raised me to believe that my faith is a shield to protect, not a sword to strike people down. And if you are a person of faith, our faith is being used against us. And if you think our faith should be a shield, then you are part of our. If you think it should be a sword, mazel tov, go with God and go with the other folks. And we have to remember that it is also about anyone who's been discriminated against because of age, because of class. If you've been denied an opportunity because the laws and the systems of our nation have devalued who you are, as our young friends, the Dreamers, today discovered, they are part of our. Their families, their mixed documentation families are part of our. I got in trouble for this in 2018, and I'll say it now. Whether you are, documentation does not determine your humanity in America. You are part of our. You may not be able to vote, but you are able to influence. And if you have citizen children or citizen relatives, encourage them to do everything. But if you were here as of April 1st, you are part of the our for the census. So fill it out, because they can't do anything to you. Our is us. And our is anyone who wants our country to be better and stronger, not based on preserving racism or its facsimile, not based on preserving discrimination, not exercising xenophobia. It's anyone who actually believes that we should be the nation we promised to be at our inception.
Our time is.
Sorry, our time is up.
Our time is in fact almost exactly now. We are in our final minute, and I'm very conscious of your time. There are about 300 million people who, 370 million people who benefit from hearing from you at this moment. But in your closing minute, is there anything you'd like to say to Wisconsin here at the Wisconsin Book Festival as we wrap up tonight's event? And you've been getting a million thank yous and accolades and heart emojis and clapping emojis from the a couple thousand people who are watching right now.
Well, I want to say thank you to you, Ben, for being such a kind and generous moderator and for letting me wax on. I want to say thank you again to the Wisconsin Book Festival, to Connor, and to the Rosen Memorial. Thank you all for listening. Wisconsin is, as you all know, you're ground zero. You were the exemplar that we use to prove that our democracy is at risk, but you're also the proof point that we can win anyway. And that's what I want people to leave with. This is going to be a terrible election cycle. It's going to be mean. It's going to be nasty. The people we want to win are going to disappoint us. They're going to hurt our feelings. They're not going to say what we want. And the people we despise are going to do even more things to disappoint us. But worse, they're going to do things to give us hope that maybe it wasn't as bad as we thought. We have to remember that this isn't about one moment or one person. This is about the progress we need to make as a nation. And that's going to require that we do the things that are the hardest to do. We have to trust that flawed people can make good decisions. if they have told us what they want to do. We have to trust that if we are willing to put our time and our sweat and our tears in, that good can come out on the other side. We have to know that racism is real, but so is grace. And that if we do our part, we will start to chip away at something that has been so oppressive and so offensive that it feels permanent, but it's not. The only thing permanent is our progress, but we have to be responsible for getting us there. In Wisconsin, we need you to lead the way. So we're counting on you.
Thank you. And you are home. We embrace you as a fellow Wisconsinite. Thank you for all of everything you're doing to help lead this fight.
Thank you so much. This has been a delight.
Ben, thank you so much for your intelligent and probing questions today. Stacey, I thank you doesn't capture it. It really, really doesn't. I don't even know. 15 years ago, I learned election law from Cheryl Rosen Weston, and this is such a testament to everything that she told all of those law students then and everything that I carry with me today. As you can see from the chat, this is just transformative for so many people, as are you. And so thank you so much for being here tonight. I did change the link at the bottom. Please purchase your copy of Our Time Is Now from Room One's Own bookstore. That's the book. This is the book. We all have a book. Stacey, I also wanted to just mention last year's Cheryl Rosen Weston lecture was Ambassador Samantha Power, and I see her book on your bookshelf right behind you. So
It's awesome.
that's just great synergy. Thank you for doing that for me. So to everyone watching today, we have 9 more Wisconsin Book Festival events this summer. The next one's on Monday, featuring Chloe Benjamin and Emily Temple. We look forward to seeing you again. Stacey, we will definitely see you again, probably tonight on the tonight.
And very quickly, I'm just going to put up this other book that's on the shelf so my sister doesn't kill me. If you're thinking about issues of religion and race, God and Blackness by Dr. Andrew Abrams. There you go. Thanks.
Wonderful. We'll leave it right there. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night.